It's a great pleasure to be able to sit down today with Neil Smith and talk about what it means to be a Christian entrepreneur. Neil is a major shareholder and director of a global transport and tourism company. It has revenues of over $1 billion a year and is a major employer. And he's also the founder of the Relay Trust, which is a charity set up to enable the training of grassroots Christian leaders in the poorest Anglican provinces of Africa. And we're currently training, I think, Neil, about 8,000 people a month. So these two things combine for Neil to be able to be part of a major global ministry. So, Neil, it's wonderful to see somebody using such substantial wealth in a dedicated way to really support the Christian church where it's most vulnerable and at its weakest. But I wonder how you became a businessman, an entrepreneur. Was this something that you had a sense of from childhood, or was it something that you became aware of later in life?
It's not from family or childhood. My father was a motor mechanic, my mother was a secretary, and there's no business going back in my family. So I didn't think I would end up where I am today, but I did have an interest in transport, and I pursued my interest in transport, and really as I pursued that, I had to become a businessman. And so really the transport led the business, and the business came along afterwards.
I imagine transport can be a pretty cutthroat business. How do you, as a Christian, bring a Christian perspective and distinctiveness to a world which I imagine can be very challenging?
Yeah, that depends on which Christian you ask, I think. So I think there are two dimensions to that. There's an ethical dimension in terms of telling the truth, in terms of delivering what you're paid to do, in terms of looking after your employees and looking after your customers. And I think that side of it's quite straightforward, and any Christian would see that. The difficulty is that the other side of being in business involves risk. It does involve at times ruthlessness. It involves competition. It involves family and church damaging hours of work. So there are a lot of dimensions on it that a lot of Christians would look at and say, you shouldn't be doing this. This is not in line with the gospel. And there's no doubt you make hard decisions. If you are in conflict over a business issue, you have to fight. And fighting is not normally seen as a Christian virtue. So there's two halves to this. And it's ethically complex. And I've made decisions that I've later regretted. So, I'm not a pillar of virtue in terms of those things. They do get very difficult sometimes.
I think that leads me on to perhaps a deeper question. I studied economics as a student, and I remember one day my tutor wrote a whole series of formulas on the blackboard to show how markets should work, the conditions of perfect competition, as it's known technically. And then he stood back from the blackboard and said, it's beautiful, but it's wicked. And I think some Christians might be inclined to see capitalism, which is basically what we're talking about,
Yes.
as something which is just inherently morally compromised. How would you respond to that?
I think the challenge is that capitalism is all about money. And if you're a businessman, you wake up in the morning thinking about money and you go to bed thinking about money, because it is about taking money and multiplying it. And given Jesus' warnings about what would happen to the rich, which I take very seriously, clearly there are huge risks if you spend your life thinking about money. on the other hand, what you're dealing with, I mean, in my case, in almost every business I know, is you're providing a service to somebody, to a government, to another company. You're charging for it, and you're trying to do it better than the other person. Now, there's nothing inherently wicked about that. And I would say that what most business people do is they focus on those things. They focus on, is my product any good? Am I giving my customer what they want? And am I producing it at the lowest possible cost? There's nothing wicked about that. That's just common sense. That's what everybody does with their household budget, but on a larger scale. So I would say no, I don't think there's anything inherently wicked about being competent, but I would say money is a risk, and if a Christian doesn't ask themselves every day, am I getting caught up in something that is temporary, and is that affecting my perspective? If they don't ask themselves that every day, they will fall over.
Yeah. I mean, we don't have to be wealthy to be covetous and envious, do we? I remember the Archbishop of Uganda at a recent conference quoting Mark Twain, who once said, "The lack of money is a root of all evil."
Yes.
So, and it seems to me that in the teaching of Jesus, particularly in the parable of the talents, he actually encourages risk-taking.
Yes.
Because it's the one who has the one talent and goes away and buries it who gets really very seriously rebuked and punished.
But when you read the Bible, you won't find any socialism.
No.
I mean, everybody there is either working for themselves or working in a small business environment. There's no one working. Very few people. I think Nicodemus worked for the government, and he was not commended. So I don't think there's anything intrinsically unbiblical about people engaging in commerce. I think the Bible is full of it.
Yeah. And Paul himself boasts, the Apostle Paul boasts how he works with his own hands.
Yes.
Reminds the Corinthians that he did not charge for the preaching of the gospel.
Yes.
So I do think there's a sense in which the criticism of capitalism is sometimes applying to a structure what is actually to do with the human heart. And that we can see wealth creation as something which is really positive and benefits other people. And a particular concern will be the underdevelopment of some nations in the global south. And we are especially aware of that because we deliberately choose in Relay Trust to work with the poorest nations. And we've seen really in the post-war period billions of dollars of aid and all sorts of initiatives, and yet the countries that, particularly the countries that we choose to work in, have remained stuck in poverty, even though we can see other areas of the global south where over the last 60 years or so, I mean, Singapore would be one of the most notable examples, of course, where there's been huge development. I was reading a book recently which included a graph which showed that in 1960, income per capita in Senegal was just half of that of Singapore. Now it's a 40th. So that's a mark of how things have changed. So when we look at the situation in Africa, which you and I are familiar with, do you think that private enterprise has a role there and can be a way of approaching these deep-seated problems of poverty that have so far resisted the attempts of many well-meaning individuals and organisations to deal with?
I think only private enterprise can lead to the generation of wealth. Governments don't generate wealth, they absorb it. They might distribute it, but they never generate it. And the future of Africa is to utilise the intrinsic money-generating capacities that Africans have. And one of the very interesting things in Africa is when the conditions are right, when the environment is right, Africans are extraordinarily entrepreneurial people, and they will create and develop businesses in situations that somebody like me could never do. So it's absolute. There is not an intrinsic problem. There is an environment. The environment in which they try to set up businesses has got barriers, and those barriers stop people doing what they would naturally do.
Your company is invested in buses in Singapore. I remember once saying to you, I won't name the country, but I remember once saying to you about a certain African city, how about investing in the buses here, Neil, because it's all pretty chaotic. And you said to me, I'd rather give the money away because if I invest it, I'll lose it.
Yes.
So what can be done to make investment in poorer nations more attractive to entrepreneurs? If that's the way forward, what are these environmental factors that need to
So
change?
this is a big question, right? This is one of the fundamental questions of human history. So, and I run a little transport company, but let me have a go. I think the interesting thing is that the history of Asia since the 1940s has actually shown it can be done. So countries, as you mentioned, Singapore, Korea, desperately poor country at the end of World War II, nearly destroyed, top to bottom. Even India, the growth of India, at present what's happening in Bangladesh. Over and over again, these countries, the Philippines, have lifted themselves out. So it's not a mystery. Like, there are examples there. You can look at these countries and say, well, they did it over there, so why didn't they do it over here? And I think there are some very key factors that go into it. The first one is education. It is absolutely linked to education. If people are not literate and numerate, then they will not progress. And in particular, you can't educate the boys and leave the girls behind. Probably the most powerful single thing you can do for development is teach women to read, because it changes their perspective. It means marriages become partnerships instead of semi-slavery, and it changes the whole dynamic. So education's essential, and it is both the foundation, which is numeracy and literacy, and then it is vocational skills and just simple business skills. The simple ability to keep a set of books, the simple ability to be able to calculate profit. These things are essential. You don't need an MBA at Harvard, but you do need certain skills. So without education, it's very hard to do it. And the foundation of what happened in Asia was a very rapid level in the quality of education. The second thing you need is a system for money to flow around. So you need a banking system that works. And fortunately, much of Africa has got a better banking system than we have in London with the use of mobile phones. But that's critical. And people need capital. And they don't need a lot of money, but they need access. And one of the curses of Africa is that people cannot get hold of capital. They need $150 to buy a sewing machine, but there is no way they can borrow $150. It's not that they need to be given $150, they just want to borrow it and pay it back, but there's no system to enable them to do that. You need a legal system. You need to know that if you work hard and make money, it's not going to be stolen from you. Stolen by criminals, stolen by rich people, or stolen by the government. So you need to have some sense of security that it's worth putting the effort in because you're going to keep the proceeds. And you need infrastructure. Above all, you need roads. You need the capacity to connect people, to connect ideas, to connect markets. Now, that's actually what you have to do. And it's not rocket science, but it is stopped. There are barriers. There are barriers of vested interests that don't want this to happen because they're making a lot of money out of the problem they've got there. There are barriers of governments that overreach and try to organise every minutiae of society. There are barriers of chaos, whether that's war or whether that's disease or whether that's inflation. And there are barriers really of capital in that roads never get built, bridges fall down, they never get fixed. So these barriers exist, but they can be identified and they can be addressed and they can be worked on.
Well, that's a very helpful overall picture. But I imagine there'll be some listening to our conversation who'll be thinking, there's nothing I can do about my government. They're just predatory and corrupt. There's nothing I can do about the roads. It can take hours just to travel from one city to another because the roads are in such a bad state. So where can ordinary people start to make a difference? And are there some micro or intermediate level initiatives that can be taken that will at least enable some form of wealth creation to begin or to move forward, even when those the big things like governance and the legal system and infrastructure may be against them and beyond immediate remedy?
Yes, well, most people listening to this are leaders of the church or activists in the church in some ways. So I might start by saying what I think the church can do about this. Now, our understanding of the faith is based on the Bible, and the Bible is a book, and the foundation of what we have is literacy. And the foundation of the church, particularly the Anglican Church, is education. And the church should and must take a lead in education. It must take a lead in making sure its members are literate. Now, the early missionaries in parts of Africa used to say you couldn't become a Christian until you're literate. So that's a little bit extreme and wasn't a very effective tool of evangelism. But once people are in a church, its leaders have got to deliver a hunger for education, and they've got to find ways of delivering education. So I think that because education is the foundation, I think that is absolutely prime. I think the second thing the church has to do is develop an understanding of the legitimacy of prosperity. Now, I'm not talking about the prosperity gospel, so-called gospel. The prosperity gospel is basically magic, right? It's something that has no place in the modern world and has no place in the Christian church. Attend this building or give money to this pastor or say this phrase and God will make you rich. Now, the Bible doesn't teach that, and if you measure it, it doesn't actually happen. But God wants his people to be prosperous. If you read the Old Testament, he didn't tell the children of Israel to stay in the Sinai desert and prayed. He told them to go into Israel and enjoy a land of milk and honey. And foundational to the Bible is that God cares for his people, and part of his love is shown in the fact that they can eat, that they can have a house, that they can live in peace. So churches have got to teach people that this is legitimate, but it comes out of hard work and it comes out of enterprise and it comes out of holding on to their Christian values. So it's intrinsic to Christian faith that the people of God enjoy the land that God has put them in. And that's not always taught. What's sometimes taught is sit down and do nothing and the government will save you. And let me say, they won't. Or sometimes it's said, get angry and take off other people, and then you'll be prosperous. And that doesn't work, because normally when you take off other people, you don't know how to hold on to what you've got, and it falls to bits. And sometimes it's said it's illegitimate to want to even enjoy prosperity. And I don't think that's biblical. And I think the church has to articulate a way that people can say that it's legitimate for me as a Christian to work towards the prosperity of my family and the prosperity of my community. So I think that's a second thing the church can do. And the third one is not pursue gifts, but pursue help. And I think one of the biggest ones is many churches work in an environment where people are promoting microfinance or the capital. They are projects that churches can do. They are small projects, and particularly the Anglican Church has their Blue Army, the Mothers Union. I mean, you have hundreds of thousands of potential budding entrepreneurs who are already organised but don't have the capital, maybe don't have the education to do it. So I think you can do those things. And I think out of that flows a lot of other things. I mean, we've talked before, an archbishop in the Congo, I once asked him, I said, what do we do to help your diocese? And his diocese had an annual income of $90 and was about the size of Belgium. And I said, how do you fix this? What can I do to help fix it? And he said, help us have a good high school. Because if we have a good high school, Christians will move into positions of influence and power, and then they will use their influence and power to bring good to the people. So it's long term, but it does tend to cycle back, if you're local, to education and to helping people help themselves.
And do you have a view on income generating projects? Because I think a common strategy for a province or a diocese is to say, let's get a big grant, from America or the UK or wherever. We'll build an office block or we'll build a guest house, and then that will give us a stream of income and make us financially secure. Do you think that's a pattern? Do you think that has a place?
If only life was so easy, right? If only making money was simply about having some money to start with, and it would eternally do it. Look, there are examples where that works. I would have to say every income generating project I've been involved with has failed. And it's failed for a number of reasons. And part of the problem is if you're a leader in the church, you've been chosen because your gifts and then later your training are in the fact that you are pastoral, are in the fact that you can teach, are in the fact that your relationships with people are constructive, in your dedication to prayer. Now, unfortunately, they are wonderful things, but they don't help you make money. Making money is a gift, it's a skill, and it is rarely found in the upper reaches of the church. And so you put people into what is a competitive environment. So you might have your fish farm, but the other guy has his fish farm, and you're a clergyman and he's a businessman. Well, he's going to win, sorry, and that's what normally happens. So I'm very suspicious of the church going into business, and I think there are huge examples where a grant has been made and all the money's been wasted because the people looking after the money didn't have the skills, the gifts, the education to look after the money. So it's not the magic pudding. It doesn't solve all the problems. And I think it's more important to focus on making the Christian community itself more prosperous and teaching them about tithing, teaching them about sharing, and then build the wealth of the church that way.
Yeah. What you've just said is very interesting because I noticed that the Global South, the GSFA, when it was at its first meeting in Limuru, in Kenya, in 1994, issued a statement, and they said that for far too long we have been dependent upon the North, and we need to move to self-sufficiency, teaching tithing, and developing the skills of our own people. And I think that was a very wise manifesto. But the fact remains that in the North, we are blessed with resources. In mission, we have a partnership with Africa in Relay Trust, which enables things to happen which simply would not be able to happen if we didn't. So without recreating dependency, how can the wealthier churches of the Anglican Communion partner with those who are in need of development and wealth creation to actually help build this self-sufficiency, economic empowerment?
I think firstly, those that are interested in this thing have got to do the research. They've got to look at what works, and they've got to look at why did Korea go from nothing to being nearly as rich as Australia? How did that happen? They've got to understand what the forces are, what the factors are. And I think people talk often out of ideology rather than out of having done the research and the facts. And I think when you do the facts, you'll show that what the church should be focusing on is what it actually knows how to do. And that is to teach and to build supportive communities and to bring in skills from partner churches in the North. And those skills can be found. I mean, the issues of venture capital, yes, that takes money. It takes money one-off and then it self-generates. And there are skills there. So I think there is a huge role for skilled people from the Christian North to engage with the Christian South. But I think the actual transfer of large amounts of wealth, if it's not accompanied by education, if it's not accompanied by skills, and if it's in an environment where businesses can't thrive anyway, it will often be lost. So if I was a bishop, and because I'm a businessman, I will never qualify on any level, but I would be looking for my partners to help me select the entrepreneurs in my congregation and to train the entrepreneurs in my congregation and to find access to capital for the members in my congregation and to teach them that their success is part of their discipleship and a work of God. And I would encourage them to keep going. And if the offer was to build a fish farm, and coming from the West, probably some species of fish that doesn't thrive there, or not knowing there's a disease or whatever, I would say, no, we don't want a fish farm. We want training, and we want your skilled people to stand beside us and teach us how to do things.
Yeah, thank you. And I think fundamentally we're coming back to Scripture here, aren't we? Because we see, I'm reminded that in the 18th century revival in England, when people were converted, men particularly stopped drinking, they stopped being violent, they became hardworking and diligent, and they prospered. And we see that in many other parts of the world as well. And I think when the Apostle Paul says that in Romans chapter 1 that the gospel is God's power to salvation, yes, it is the power to save us, but that salvation then has fruit in our lives in all sorts of ways. And I think what you've really so helpfully set out for us has been how part of that fruit is a proper human prospering, is recognising our gifts and calling those gifts out and releasing the body of Christ to be fully itself, and its different members fulfilling their different roles.
Yes.
I think you, if I remember rightly, I think you either began or came close to beginning training for ordination.
Well, I did. I've had 2 attempts at studying theology, and in both cases I fell at the hurdle of learning Greek, and also at the hurdle of many of my Christian friends doubting that whatever my calling might be, it was probably not to be pastoral, and it was probably not to preach. Because I don't have those gifts, as you know, Charles. I'm not always a particularly nice person.
I would disagree.
I'm focused on getting things done, right? And
yes.
that is a skill I have. Now, someone who is...
But you get them done in a kind way, if I may say
Sometimes. I have enemies. But, someone who is a pastor whose focus is on just getting things done is probably not going to be a great encouragement to the members of the congregation, particularly the weak. And I would be a terrible pastor, and I would be a terrible full-time Christian worker, because I focus on material, measurable things. I focus on setting goals and measuring the achievement of them. I am merciless on myself if those goals are missed, which makes me somewhat merciless on others if their goals are missed. So studying theology was actually extraordinarily good for me, but it didn't lead me to ministry, and it should not have led me to ministry. And I really thank God that it led me into business, because I am where I should be. I get up in the morning and I make money, and in the afternoon I give it away, and it's used to the glory of God, and I am very satisfied with that package.
Well, I hope what you've just said will be a great encouragement to people who themselves might be thinking, I really want to serve Christ, and assume that that's got to be within the church, within the church as an organisation, but their calling may actually be into a tougher place in the world, but to use their gifts, if they have your kind of aptitude and temperament, they will be much more fruitful in the long run for the kingdom of God. I mean, earlier this week, I had an email from one of our bishop partners in Madagascar, and he was reporting the number of new churches, which were over 30, that had resulted from the training and teaching work that we are enabling in that part of Madagascar. And I think that you, as a Christian businessman, have enabled many more people to come into the kingdom of God than most clergy. Yes, you're supporting the pastors and clergy, but the impact of your faithfulness with the gifts that God has given you, both natural and material, has had a huge impact for good. And we know that in all the provinces where we work, people will say that the work of Relay Trust has been transformative. But none of that the reality is that none of that would have happened without money. And in the long term, of course, we hope that these provinces and these churches will become self-sufficient, and that what we're doing will enable them to move into that. Yes. But I think your testimony, your story, is a huge encouragement to people who feel called to be entrepreneurs, not to feel this is somehow second-rate or a bit dubious, but under God, to really go for it.
I think, though, a few things I have to respond to there.
Okay.
I don't think what I do is harder than what would be working full-time in the church, but I think it's fuzzier. It's harder to see the boundaries. It's harder to understand what you're allowed to do and what you're not allowed to do. So it's more confusing, and it's harder to get help, because the people you go to for advice generally have no idea what you're doing. So I'd say that. I'd say the second thing is I'm doing exactly what you're doing. I'm following my calling. You know, I thank God for what he's given me, but, you know, he's on my back. You know, I've got a job to do, and I'm not giving away what's mine, and therefore am a good person. I'm giving away what God has given me to give away. And I am just like you, like everyone listening to this. You know, I am God's servant, trying to understand how to do it best.
Great. Well, thank you, Neil. I'm sure this has been hugely encouraging to everyone listening. So thank you very much for joining us.
Wonderful.
Neil,
I hope
thank
it's
you
a
so
wonderful
much.
trip.
Thank you.
Thank you.